The next topic is the continuity debate. Communication skills of non-human primates studied either in the wild or in the laboratory, they fall well short of the full range of human language. So this is the area, this is the point that has been under debate. Chomsky and other researchers, they also proposed the faculty language broad and the concept of faculty language narrow, which is FLB and FLN. With regard to faculty language narrow, there are more studies which are needed to look at this phenomena, but faculty language broad, according to Chomsky, is something which allows humans and not chimpanzees or apes to master language without explicit instructions. Whereas studies on apes, they have demonstrated that when they are placed in the language enriched environment, which is basically the implicit learning environment, they tend to perform far better than the ones who are placed in the explicit learning environment. Like children, apes who are raised in language enriched environment, they do demonstrate the preference of word order and also the understanding of syntax. Now, the element or the role of reinforcement in language learning still remains underspecified as far as apes and humans are concerned. Now, in wild, non-human primates display signals that have meaning, but the signals fail to achieve some characteristics of defined language, and those characteristics which basically defines language. So when we are considering this aspect, which is the continuity debate, we have to look at the definition of language. That's a key area. Now, defining or determining the relationship between these, language has to be defined. Researchers, some rely on basically as a medium of communication, but then there are researchers who focus on the linguistic units of language as the key components. We have phonology, phonetics, semantics, syntax, and pragmatics, and so on. So signals which are produced by non-humans, they do not cover all the essential characteristics of the language. Moreover, the system of communication is very limited since all these components are not covered. Therefore, their system is very limited. The communication system is very limited. Human language is qualitatively different than the communication systems of non-human primates. The linguistic skills of chimpanzees and bonobos taught American Sign Language or other language-like systems are more impressive at the level of semantics. However, these laboratory animals do not seem to easily grasp syntax. Thus, it can be concluded that human language is qualitatively different than the communication system of non-human primates, and by extension, the common species from which humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos evolved. Darwinian theory is based on the concept of continuity, the notion that evolutionary change are quantitative rather than qualitative. Now, according to Darwin, there can be no doubt that the difference between the mind of the lowest man and that of the highest animal is immense. Nevertheless, the difference, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind. Now, Darwin also emphasized that the presence of this conclusion is not changed by considering language. And he further says, and I quote, "Nor does the faculty of articulate speech in itself offer an insuperable objection to the belief that man has been developed from some lower form. In the third part, we see that language appears to be qualitatively different than animal communication system. It is difficult to see how such a powerful system of communication could have gradually evolved from simpler system. As a consequence, some prominent theorists have also argued that language evolved very rapidly in a single step. For example, Chomsky has stated that rather than being simply a more complex instance of something to be found elsewhere in the animal world, language is an example of true emergence, that experience of a qualitatively different phenomenon at a specific stage of complexity of organization. It would be error then to suppose that all properties or the interesting properties of the linguistic structures that have evolved can be explained in terms of natural selection. Natural selection is the theory proposed by Darwin. Then we have Pinker and Bloom, who argue that language is qualitatively different than animal communication may have evolved process of nature. Now this is something which they proposed. For example, language gives one the ability to learn from others rather than directly learning about predators, thus putting oneself at risk. This kind of second-hand learning is faster and safer than first-hand learning. In addition, in a group of interdependent individuals, it is advantageous to know that the internal states of other members of the group. Evolutionary theory assumes that there is genetic variation between animals and individuals. For example, some giraffes have longer necks and that some variations have greater survival value than others. But Pinker and Bloom report the studies conducted by Gopnik who found a familial pattern of deficits in morphological abilities that strongly suggest a genetic explanation. Then there is another criticism that the intermediate steps that led to the evolution of language do not have obvious survival value. If the continuity view is correct, these steps must have been selected successfully over generations. And this implies that each successive form of language is in some sense better than the predecessors. Pinker and Bloom further respond that there are in fact many intermediate forms of language, such as pigeons, aphasia, and so on. And they further says that they point even minute changes in language may lead to small selective advantages that build over time. It is impossible to know exactly how languages evolved, and undoubtedly we need to explore further many aspects of natural selection account. But the conclusion that natural selection cannot account for language requires further exploration.